Hello, students. This is Professor Karasi with Chapter 2 for Cognitive Psychology. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. And I left right here on Chapter 2, the brain. So one thing I want to talk about before we get started is this is a pretty heavy chapter. This talks about a lot of brain anatomy and physiology. This isn't a biological psych class. I don't need you to know everything, but it is a cognitive psych class that kind of draws a lot on brain biology. So I do want you to know many of these parts and lobes and subdivisions, etc. But I'm going to make it as palatable for you as possible, so that it's not too much. So first thing we're going to talk about is the central nervous system, also known as the CNS. The CNS comprises two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. That's what the central nervous system is. If one of those two things are damaged, it can wreak havoc on one's system in terms of functioning and ability to function independently, because the brain and the spinal cord rather, are two of the most essential parts of the body that we need to have working in order to stabilize behavior and function. So the central nervous system, which is what I just defined for you, includes a couple of nervous systems. Well, sorry. I talked about the central nervous system as one of them. The second nervous system is the PNS, also known as peripheral nervous system. And that includes all of the rest of the body that are not the spine or the brain. So these include skeletal muscle, um, uh, tissues, glands, all of skin, all of that is part of the peripheral nervous system and not the CNS. So that's kind of the deciding factor. Okay. A neuron is more functionally important of glial cells. And wait a minute. Neurons basically are billions of, how do I say, units that comprise the nervous system. We have billions of neurons um, that contribute to our both nervous systems. So a network of billions of cells that work together to create thinking, behavior, etc. So the parts of the neuron, I'm sure you've learned in Psych 1, but I'll kind of reintroduce them. A soma or cell body, that's kind of where all of the information is integrated and understood and processed. The axon is the long tubular structure that comes out of the neuron where chemical signals travel down to get to the next neuron. It's kind of like the transportation mode. A dendrite is branch-like extensions coming out of the axon where neurotransmitters are fired. Myelin sheath is the fatty substance of a neuron that insulates the axon. So because these chemical messages are constantly going down the axon, let's see if they have a picture. It'd be a lot nicer to have a picture to show you, but they don't. They just have a picture of gray and white matter. Um, Myelin insulates and protects the axon because it's used so much. So it's just this fatty substance that kind of helps keep that axon functional and undamaged. The nucleus is the center of operation or the brain of a neuron. Um, a cluster of neuron cell bodies is referred to a ganglion. So if you've got several together, you don't need to know about tract. Okay. Okay, here we go. Lower level structures of the brain. So these I do indeed want you to know. Um, so the lower level of the brain is here, okay, at the brainstem and the spinal cord, along with the cerebellum. Cerebellum deals with balance and coordination. So if a person's cerebellum is damaged, they may not be able to hold balance or have physical coordination cerebrally. The hindbrain includes three structures, the medulla or the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. The hindbrain is known as the most primitive part of the brain. This part of the brain is predominantly responsible for survival types of things, breathing, sleep-wake cycles, the ability to swallow, things that keep us alive is what the hindbrain is responsible for. So if anything goes wrong in the hindbrain, it could be catastrophic theoretically because you may not be able to breathe. You may not be able to um, uh, sleep appropriately or eat appropriately, or your heart rate. That's another part of the hindbrain. Specifically, the parts within the hindbrain, like I said, are the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla sits at the transition zone between the brain and the spinal cord. It's the first region that formally belongs to the brain as opposed to the spinal cord because they are so close. It is the control center for respiratory, cardiovascular, and digestive functions. Those are three super important things. You have to be able to breathe, your heart has to be working appropriately, and you have to be able to digest. Those are major things that we need to do to survive, and that's what the medulla is primarily responsible for. The pons connects the medulla oblongata with the midbrain region, which is the next area up, and also relays signals from the forebrain to the cerebellum. It houses the control centers for respiration and inhibitory functions. The cerebellum is attached to the dorsal side of the pons. So again, pons is responsible for respiration. Very important. Cerebellum is a separate region of the brain located behind the medulla oblongata and pons. It is attached to the rest of the brain by three stalks and coordinates skeletal muscles to produce smooth, graceful motions. The cerebellum receives info from our eyes, ears, muscles, and joints about the body's current positioning. And it also receives output from the cerebral cortex about where these body parts should be. Again, coordination and balance, as well as posture. Cerebellum deals with posture as well, and gross and fine motor skills. The midbrain, so hindbrain back here, midbrain up here, that the midbrain also houses several areas, and we're going to go over those. So we're going to start with the thalamus. The thalamus is part of the limbic system. It consists of two lobes of gray matter along the bottom of the cerebral cortex. Because nearly all sensory info passes through the thalamus, it is considered the sensory way station of the brain, passing info onto the cerebral cortex, which is the forebrain. Lesions of or stimulation to the thalamus are associated with changes in emotional reactivity. So how we emotionally react to stimuli can be changed if we stimulated or in any way, what did it say? Let's see. Basically stimulated that area of the brain through electrodes, etc. Okay. So the limbic system, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Here's a nice little picture for you. I'm not sure why the wording is in Spanish, but you have the limbic system and you have the brainstem. Basically, that's what it's accounting for in there. The hypothalamus is a small part of the brain located just below the thalamus. Lesions of the hypothalamus interfere with motivated behaviors like sexual behavior, combativeness, and hunger. The hypothalamus also plays a role in emotion. Parts of the hypothalamus seem to be involved in pleasure and rage, while the central part is linked to aversion, displeasure, and tendency towards uncontrollable and loud laughing. When external stimuli are presented, the hypothalamus sends signals to either limbic areas to trigger feeling states in response to the stimuli. Um, our startle reflex also is controlled by the hypothalamus, where if someone's behind you, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, I've certainly experienced this, where you don't know, and then all of a sudden you just kind of jump up like, oh my goodness. The hypothalamus has a lot to do with that. Okay, the spinal cord, which is not part of the midbrain, but is its own entity, is a tail-like structure embedded in the vertebral canal of the spine. The adult spinal cord is about 40 centimeters long and weighs about 30 grams. The spinal cord is attached to the underside of the medulla oblongata and is organized to serve four distinct tasks: to convey sensory info to the brain, to carry info generated in the brain to peripheral targets like skeletal muscles, to control nearby organs via autonomic nervous system, and to enable sensory motor functions to control posture and other fundamental movements. So all super important for functioning. Okay. So the corpus callosum, I do want you to know, and I think they had a picture. Did they have a picture of it? No. The corpus callosum is this wide, flat bundle of neural fibers in the center of our brain that connects the right and the left hemisphere. Okay, everyone has to have a fully functioning corpus callosum for both sides of the brain to fully function. So, corpus callosum connects again the left and right cerebral hemispheres and facilitates interhemispheric communication between the right and the left lobes. Neuroplasticity, I do want you to know what that is. The ability of a brain to adapt to experience, which all of our brains are very capable of doing that. It enables the brain to compensate for damage to one hemisphere by taking on extra functions in the other half, especially in young brains. So sometimes certain skill sets in one area of the brain is not fully developed yet. So in children, language and reading and those types of things are learned behaviors residing within the left brain that are not fully developed. So the right brain kind of compensates for that while the left brain is still developing, and vice versa. Okay, so here's a nice diagram of the lobes of the brain, and I'm going to go over those next with you. So you have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Those are the ones I want you to be familiar with. So the frontal lobe is super important. Frontal lobe houses all of our what we call executive functioning, like decision making, emotional control, impulse control, those types of things that are pretty consequential in human behavior. So when you hear about a person having their frontal lobe damaged, whether it be in an accident or trauma, what have you, sometimes you hear stories about them losing their temper more frequently, or them not having the ability to control their impulses and acting out in different ways. That would make sense in that that's kind of the region that is responsible for all of those higher order functions. Super, super important. Planning and engaging in goal-directed behavior, recognizing consequences, choosing between good and bad actions, overriding and suppressing socially unacceptable responses. That's huge, right? We know what to do in public versus not. Okay. If a person has an issue with the frontal lobe, that might be affected, and they may no longer know the social moras and what would be socially appropriate versus not. Determining similarities and differences between objects and situations. And the limbic system is within that frontal lobe as well. An emotional processing all happens within the frontal lobe as well. Temporal lobe houses two very important areas, the Broca area and the Wernicke area. Broca area has a lot to do with speech, okay, where we learn how to use language and how we pronounce our words and those types of things. Temporal lobe is associated with retention of short and long-term memories. It processes sensory input, including auditory info, language comprehension, and naming. It also creates emotional responses and controls biological drives such as aggression and sexuality. So the hippocampus is kind of our memory center. It's a part within the temporal lobe. When we look at memory retention, whether it be long-term versus short-term versus working memory, etc., the hippocampus is a very active part of all memory formation and maintenance. The amygdala is also very important in memory because oftentimes we remember based on feeling. So if we remember a feeling of a memory, that aids us in the recall of that memory. The left temporal lobe holds a primary auditory cortex, which is important for the processing the semantics of speech. One specific portion of the temporal lobe, known as the Wernicke's area, plays a key role in speech comprehension. So while Broca deals with the actual kind of anatomy of speech, Wernicke's looking at the comprehension of speech. Okay, and occipital lobe also houses your retina, which is part of your eye, your visuospatial processing, color discrimination, and motor perception. The parietal lobe is associated with sensory skills. It integrates different types of sensory info and is particularly useful in spatial processing and navigation. The parietal lobe plays an important role in integrating sensory info from various parts of the body. You know something? I'm just recognizing that I do not have my screen shared. So I need to share that. I apologize for that. Okay. Areas of the forebrain include lobes that we've already talked about, the thalamus, smell, limbic system or emotional center, the hippocampus in charge of memories, hypothalamus regulates a number of homeostatic processes. And when we say homeostatic processes, they include things like heart rate, respiratory rate, etc. Homeostasis means an equilibrium or at a, how do I explain it? Equilibrium is the definition of homeostasis. So for instance, if a person's having an anxiety attack and they're breathing too quickly, their breathing has now left a homeostasis condition because they're hyperventilating. Okay. The amygdala is involved in our experience of emotion and in tying emotional experience meaning to our memories. Absolutely. Absolutely. Amygdala is especially active during adolescence and kind of moves toward a more homeostatic stage as we approach early adulthood. Okay, and what is all this? Okay, midbrain. So within the midbrain, we have structures. The reticular formation is centered in the midbrain. It extends up into the forebrain and down into the hindbrain, so it kind of runs the gamut of the brain. Reticular formation is important in regulating sleep-wake cycles, arousal, alertness, and motor activity, all super important. The substantia nigra also is the main structure within the midbrain. And both regions contain cell bodies that produce a neurotransmitter dopamine, and both are critical for movement. Super important. So dopamine is kind of like that feel-good hormone that is released, or neurotransmitter that is released as a result of feeling relief, satiation, things like that. I don't know if you've ever heard of dopamine chasing, but oftentimes we read and we see things in our society where people are categorizing events as a dopamine chasing kind of behavior, where a person is constantly trying to increase the levels of dopamine running through their system. And the substantia nigra is critical in that dopamine production. We talked about the medulla and the pons, talked about the cerebellum. And here's another nice list of the parts we discussed. Don't need to necessarily know about the homunculus, but read about it. Okay, so it looks like this is kind of review the brain, the spinal cord, the two hemispheres being the right and the left. You don't need to know all of the subdivide. You do want to know what the corpus callosum does and how important that is. Here's your glossary. Neuroplasticity again, where your experience changes things. Okay. This is just a lot of information that you can certainly read through. It's all very important. I just don't need you to know everything. So trauma, this is very important in cortical responses. So I want you to think about, let's see. I'm going to read to you about Phineas Gage. This is one of the major studies that talked about brain trauma. So Phineas Gage, dating back to 1848, was a railroad worker who had a metal spike impale his prefrontal cortex, which is up here. He survived the accident, but according to secondhand accounts, his personality changed drastically. Friends described him as no longer acting like himself, whereas he was a hardworking, amiable man before the accident. He turned into an irritable, temperamental, and lazy man after the accident. Many of the accounts of this change may have been inflated in the retelling, and some behavior was likely attributed to alcohol use as a pain medication. However, the account suggests that some aspects of his personality did indeed change. Also, there's new evidence that though his life changed drastically, he was able to become a functioning stagecoach driver, suggesting that the brain has the ability to recover even after major trauma. So, again, we don't have a lot of substantial backing to the claims about Phineas, but there is enough to suggest that there was some personality and aptitude changes. And there's Phineas with that rod. I mean, imagine that. Look at that skeletal picture. My goodness. And that looks like we are ending chapter 2. So just to kind of recap, I do want you to know parts of the brain. I want you to know the lobes of the brain. I want you to know the functions of the brain. Those are the overarching concepts for chapter 2. And with that, I'll go ahead and end sharing my screen if I can. Stop share. And I'll end this session. Bye-bye.